Thank you, Vicente, for inviting me. It's fantastic to be at IAAC, always one of the most exciting places in the architecture world. What Vicente didn't tell you is that I've known him since he was a kid. And I was also a kid, and a very, very good local architect whose work you should all know, called Jose Luis Mateo, said, you should come to Barcelona. I have this guy who works for me, who is the smartest person working for me, absolutely incredible. But unlike you, who's also smart, he actually knows how to make buildings. So you should meet him. And in fact, you should stay with him. So I stayed with Vicente, Nuria, and Leon. I think Leon had just been born. So it's been a very, very long time. I realized someone made a comment or asked a question just before the lecture starts. And for those of you that are watching this online, and maybe even for some of you who are in the audience, I guess it's inevitable that when you travel around the world and talk, you develop a couple of different things you talk about. So my latest book that just came out is actually called The Monster Leviathan and Architecture, and I could talk about that. But this is a book that comes out in the fall. The reason I mention it is that, of course, everything these days is being streamed and is on YouTube and Lord knows where else. So this is a version of a talk I've given before, and I change it continually, but for those of you that have already seen it online, if you want to go get a wine instead, I will perfectly understand. But this is based on a book that will come out in the fall, and it's actually not written for architects. It's written for the general public, which was very difficult, and I'm still struggling with it. They sent me a note last week, and the editor said, it says here facade. What do you mean by facade? What is facade? And I said, well, it's the face of a building. And so instead of facade, it's now face of a building. But it's based on some work I've been doing for some time now that comes out of theoretical precepts, but also from the fact that as I do travel around the world, I've been seeing more and more work that I call imaginative reuse, which is to say it's a kind of reuse that does not wipe out the past by putting something new in it, nor does it slavishly follow what is already there, but it reimagines and opens up the existing structures with all of their history that are embedded within them in such a way that we can both live in them, work in them, play in them, and interpret them in new ways. And that's what I call imaginative architecture. I'll try to show you some examples of it. But it also comes from a very simple realization. After working with some people looking at all of the claims for how we make sustainable architecture, I came to the conclusion, in contradiction to probably most of the people at IAAC and my friend Enrique Rez and others, that it is impossible to make a new building that is truly sustainable. Even if you make a net zero or net positive building, the amount of extraction that has to occur in order to make the building, the amount of transportation that it takes to bring the materials there, the amount of labor it takes to put all of this in, already means that you are using up natural resources that cannot be replenished and are contributing to the further pollution and degradation of our planet in such a way that it will become a much less biodiverse place, and one of the one of the animals that might disappear in that lack of biodiversity long before the cockroaches will be human beings. I'm sure you all know that construction is one of the largest contributors to the climate change issues that we are facing. I'm sure that you know all these issues about extraction. I do not believe, unlike Vicente, that wood is the answer, because almost when you get to the point that wood can be used in a manageable way in construction, it has to be planted in plantations that themselves are devastating for their biotopes, and whose fast growth reuse also is not very good for our planet. So the real answer to making sustainable architecture is to just don't build, to use what we already have. And you might say, well, we don't have enough. Well, in fact, we do. Often it's in the wrong places or of the wrong kind, which just means that for those of us interested in architecture and urbanism, our attention should be focused on how we reuse, where we reuse, and how we reassemble buildings. And if you can't completely reuse a building, at least reuse all of the parts of a building. And there are some architects who are now able to create buildings out of up to 96% reused, recycled, and upcycled parts. The second reason why we should be using, only reusing and not using up, is that we need to open up our existing structures for new people to use them. Our structures were built for certain classes of people, the people who could afford them, and they not only fit their needs, but also convey their values. When we make new buildings, we repeat those same values and those same ways of organizing space in a very direct way. We build social housing that is cheap and demeaning for people, and we build beautiful architecture for rich people to live in. And I believe that if we can figure out how to open up and reuse our existing structures, we might break through some of those barriers. And finally, I just think that there is a beauty to existing buildings that is very difficult to ignore. And the people here from Moldova, but even the people right here in Poblenou will, I'm sure, understand what I'm talking about. It's not just for architects that that's an issue. Break it. If someone wants to join on the conversation, I guess we can have a conversation instead of a lecture. I hate to break it to all of you. Maybe someone didn't want me to say that, but most people other than you hate architecture. And the reason they hate architecture is because it's always new. And being new, it's always alien. They like things, most people, including us, if you really admit it, like things to live in that are familiar, that are worn, that have a sense of history to them. And so that's the third reason why we need to think about mining the beauty of existing structures. My thinking about this really comes out of my more general thinking on two issues, not only beauty, which is the easy one, but also the problems that we have at a larger level that architecture must address. This is a wonderful project in Los Angeles where an artist was given the usual 1% for arts, which meant almost no money, to fix up a very derelict part of Watts in Los Angeles. And he figured out that there was not enough money to do anything. So instead, he spent all the money on buying gold leaf and outlined in the Kitsuge method, in the Japanese emphasizing of cracks and imperfections, all of the cracks in the pavement of this unused basketball court, and had just enough money left over to buy new basketball hoops. So for me, it's the very emblem of the beauty of restoration in both a physical and a social way. But whoever it was, are you going to talk about that big round building? Yes, I am going to talk about the big round building, because for me, this is the emblem of where architecture is right now and where we should not be. Professor Goulart and I today had a conversation. He believes that every 20 to 25 years, architecture changes radically. Well, this was produced with the thinking of around 2000 to 2010, and it is the most expensive building per square foot in the world. Well, the most expensive office building per square foot in the world. It is also obviously the most perfect. It is the omega of architecture. It is the perfect round structure. It is the be-all and end-all of architecture, a building so slick that no one can find their way in it, and birds die by the thousands, as well as broken noses, because of the slickness of the glass. It is, of course, the Apple headquarters by Norman Foster, which makes it even more of an important building because it embodies all of the power and all of the wealth that we concentrate in very few hands. And I have absolutely no doubt that Stephen Jobs is still buried in the middle of this panopticon so that he can make sure that all is still well in the slickness of Apple land. This is about as perfect a building as you can make, except that, whoops, I went over one, except that even before this building was finished, they had to build this piece of shit because the building didn't have enough space and the space wasn't useful enough. So they had a no-name architect do these buildings, which I believe they have since sold and built other buildings. And it embodies the fact that you cannot make perfect buildings. Those of you that want to be architects and want to make a perfect building, give up now. Because even if you make it as perfect as Lord Norman Foster was able to do with $1 billion budget and the latest technology and a client who let him do whatever he wanted, and you made the perfect O, the perfect omega, the perfect N, it still will not be enough because things change, people change, usage change even before the building is finished. And the architecture will never be able to embody that complete ideal. Moreover, of course, in our age, the idea of making monumental buildings that are fixed, that stand still, that remain, is just completely silly and ridiculous. All you essentially need is a screen, is a way to, as most of you are doing while I'm talking, communicate, surf, do whatever you need to do in order to be at home in the modern world. And in reality, the endless web of interconnection that sprawls all around us from our brains out to the farthest reaches of the universe is only an iteration of the physical sprawl that spreads from here through Valles and all the way down the coast continually, way past Valencia. I mean, I think if you drive down the coast from Barcelona or from north of here, from Girona, all the way down to the Costa del Sol, you'll maybe hit about 2 moments of a half an hour where everything is not built up. Sprawl is the reality of the condition in which we live, not the prettiness of Barcelona with all of its carefully controlled sites, but this incredibly polluted and polluting beast that catches us continually in its maw. This one should have been first, sorry. So it's not the exemplar and the beauty of the grid, which Goulart again was able to make better when he was a city architect. It is the reality of what lies beyond there, and the fact that all of our cities are turning into these giant morasses that, moreover, are becoming physical morasses because, of course, the way they are built and designed, the way we use resources to build and design, means that we are literally cutting the ground from under our feet and filling it with water in some places and desertification in other areas. At the same time, of course, that kind of reality is creating incredible social dichotomies and tensions that pop up in all kinds of ways. Of course, this is, in a way, even a kind of privileged protest in Detroit in front of the great Renaissance Center. But the reality of sprawl at its worst is the tens of millions of people who every year have to migrate in the hope of not starving, in the hope of staying alive, because of the kind of capitalist economic system we have created and its physical translation into architecture and urbanism. At the same time, the physical structures that are meant to catch these continual flows of people and goods and ideas that are the reality of our completely interconnected world are breaking down more and more. And COVID only formalized what's been going on for quite some time, which is that the idea of building office buildings is just absolutely ridiculous. No one really needs them as places to do anything other than to have meetings or to socialize or to have a sense that you actually are part of a real organization, which most corporations aren't anyhow, but that's another question. And so as a result, vacancy rates in American cities, and Europe is not far off, are now rising up to 30%. And this is an undercounting because it doesn't account yet for all the offices that are still officially occupied but are not occupied by physical people. It's just that the companies still have to pay rent for them. We don't need these kind of inflexible structures. And if you take away anything today, even if you still want to build, at least don't build office buildings. They are the most useless piece of trash that is part of architecture, even if some of them are kind of beautiful. So underneath all of this, of course, is this reality of a world in which those flows are our reality. The reality is that flow is our reality. Sorry for that. And we are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And it is producing a world in which the difference between the machine, the human being, the beast, and the flows of technology that course through all of them is very difficult to understand in any case. So, what do you do? Well, the answer, and this directly goes to this question of what is the new parameter in architecture. Just about 25 years ago, Patrick Schumacher, the head of the Zaha Hadid office, as it's still unfortunately called, said that the future is parametric, that we should go with the flows, and that the new 1,000-year Reich will be the digital one, where we as architects harness technology in order to make completely fluid structures. And that was going to be the answer to everything. And it produced buildings that turned out to be fluid, but essentially the same office buildings, hotels, shopping malls, apartment buildings that still used energy in hugely wasteful manners that were only accessible to those people who could afford it or looked like they could behave like they could afford it, and that were just newer versions of the same paradigms. Some architects thought that we could push that even further by understanding that technology and the tools, especially of software that are available to architects, allows us to be rapacious in our gathering together of imageries and forms from all walks of life and assembling new possible structures out of them. This is Mark Foster Gage proposing buildings that are made from everything from elements of Art Deco buildings to dildos and Lord knows what else. I'm more interested in the use of digital form that goes with the flow in terms of saying what we now have is a reality in which an infinite set of newer possibilities are available to us, not, I would say, in a radically different way, as some people have argued, but just at a different scale and with a different mode of ability to cross boundaries between physical, digital, between art, architecture, and any other field. And so, to put it bluntly, I'm less interested in Grasshopper than I am in Photoshop. I think that the ability to act as hunter and gatherers in this fluid world of ours, and then to question how we might reassemble that world, is in the end much more productive. And one of the first built products of this kind of thinking is what I thought was a wonderful building that really got me thinking. It's in a very small town called Schendel in the Netherlands. And Schendel is where Winnie Maas, one of the partners of the firm MVRDB, grew up. And one day he got a phone call from the mayor who said, "Mr. Maas, when you were 9 years old, you made a little drawing of our town square and said, our town square should look like this. It's horrible right now." And luckily, my predecessors kept that sketch. And now that you are a world-famous architect, we would like you to come and actually build our new town square. There's only one problem. The only way we can pay for it is by making what is, in essence, a small shopping mall. And no one in town wants to see a shopping mall on our town square. So, Mr. Maas, come here, solve that problem. So he went there with a very good photographer, and they photographed every single building in the town of Schendel. Then they combined them all using Photoshop and a few other programs and blew them up 120% and printed them on glass. So the result is a completely familiar building that you yet cannot know because it's a combination of all the buildings of Schendel that seems to be fully solid and existing, but has this sense of being only a print, only a mirage, only a kind of ghost in which the past is able to control the future. The future. And I find myself looking more and more at projects that are difficult to find, where you have to ask yourself, what is the architect, the designer, in this case, the artist, doing? Where here is the architecture? And I find that the ability to get us to focus on and understand and reinterpret spaces is probably more enticing to me than a well-designed Miesian cross-section column pleated in chrome and with screws that are almost invisible. I prefer this kind of invisibility, a kind of ghost architecture that is almost not present, that is almost not there. And as I was looking at this thing, I began realizing that 1973, 1974 was a very important moment. Several things happened in that period right around the same time. One was that Gordon Clark was working in New York. And Gordon Mother Clark, for those of you who don't know, was an architect, trained as an architect, who became an artist in New York in the 60s, died very young. And one day he got permission from his gallery owner, Lord knows how, to take a Sawzall and cut her house straight down the middle, leaving it to settle on its haunches. And Gordon Mother Clark went on to cut more buildings and cut holes in buildings. He wound up discovering these spiraling spaces that he could open up in existing structures in places like Paris, or just a gesture to the sunrise in an abandoned pier that was used for cruising. He also was invited by Peter Eisenman, an architect, to make an installation at the one of the forerunners of IAAC, the Institute for Architecture and Urbanism in New York. And his answer was to shoot out all the windows with a BB gun, not something that Eisenman took to very nicely. And almost the same time, in a very different way, Carlo Scarpa was finally finishing the 20-year renovation of the Castle Vecchio, the old castle in Verona, where he had been carefully slicing and dicing away at a fabric that dated back to the Middle Ages, had parts from the 16th century, 17th century, from a Napoleonic occupation, from the 1920s, and he began revealing selectively the bits and pieces of the building in a completely fetishistic manner, in a manner that allows you to really sense the flavor and the life that occurred within these buildings. I used to say that as a curator, I had a sign over my door that said, "No commodification, yes fetishization." Fetishization is a great way to get you to focus on something that's there. This was understood at, again, almost the same time, 1973, by the artist David Ireland, who bought a house on Cap Street, 500 Cap Street in San Francisco, began renovating it, and fell in love with the act of renovating it, to the point that he not only polished things, he put beeswax on the walls to make them shine. He took away wallpaper where he thought it revealed something beautiful and left the rest. He took all of the brooms he used to sweep out the place and turned it into an artwork. He even made a dent that was left for the second time by a safe as he tried to take it downstairs, and made it part of the architecture. He made a building that was a completely immersive work of art. And a young architect came to visit it and said, "Aha, I can do this too, because I have the job to take a huge industrial factory in Western Massachusetts and turn it into the modern art museum that was called Mass MoCA." So he tried to apply some of David Ireland's principles at the scale of this building, and that then became incredibly influential for museum design in general. What he didn't know, when I asked him, was that actually a few years before that, Frank Gehry had done the same thing at the Temporary Contemporary in Los Angeles. And it was right before I went to work for Frank Gehry, who, by the way, when I asked him who his favorite architect was, he said Gordon Mother Clark. That's how I found out about Gordon Mother Clark. But he showed me around the office, and he showed me this building and said, "Don't tell anyone, but I'm not really doing anything." And that was the point of the architecture. He had to put a ramp in for handicap access. He had to coat the walls up to 8 feet for fireproofing, and he had to clean up and seal the skylights. And that was all he did. He let the rest of the building reveal itself. And of course, he had done exactly the same thing in his own house, where he had just taken off the covering to allow the stud structure of the walls to reveal themselves, and had left the existing house behind an assemblage of industrial materials that to the neighbors and the local critics appeared like an industrial shed had suddenly been added on to this sweet little Queen Anne house. And even the floor of the kitchen was the asphalt driveway, which, as his wife pointed out, was extremely easy to clean. Now, this attitude towards renovation really became mainstream in museums. I could spend a whole lecture, and I'm already going on much too long, talking about all the different museums that have used these techniques. This is really where it's been at its core. You have them here in Barcelona. You have them in every city in the world. The person who really made it respectable to do it, not just in funky avant-garde art museums, but in mainstream museums, was Sir David Chipperfield, a very bad architect who happened to do one pretty good building where he kept all of the marks of the existing building, including the billet holes and the bomb fragments from the Second World War, and made a kind of ghost of the original staircase in the middle of it to create this architecture that veers between the modern and the old in an extremely appealing way. But this drive to imaginative reuse also came from a completely different side. It came from the reuse of these kind of industrial buildings. It also came from the ground up, if you will. In 1993, a group of young designers who eventually called themselves droog design, which means dry design, as one critic put it, dry like a martini, descended on the Salone, the furniture fair in Milan, and brought with them not the latest, slickest sofa, not the latest version of the stackable plastic chair, but instead they brought with them a piece called Chest of Drawers, which was drawers that the artist had found at the flea market and then put together with moving tape, moving straps, or half of a porcelain vase with half of a plastic milk bottle added onto it, piling up a whole bunch of rags to make a very comfortable chair, or taking what were then the logos of all the Fortune 500 companies and making a new religious icon called Bling Bling. He's now redone it in titanium, of course, with the new ones. But the tradition of this goes, of course, even further than this. And that is in the use of spolia. When we were at Badaura today, that term already came up. The idea of reusing the existing building stock that you have to create new buildings is something that has been embedded for architecture for ages. And if you look carefully, you can find it even in the grandest structures all around you. And I need to speed up. So for me, all of this really came together, this notion of reusing and of understanding the reuse as a form of art making that could even show art. The idea of a ghost architecture came together when I started seeing what for me are the monuments of imaginative architecture. If the churches made out of spolia of temples and the palaces of the rich people are the monuments of the last millennium, the great factories and coal mines of the Industrial Revolution were the monuments of the Industrial Revolution, and they are now becoming the central monuments for me of imaginative reuse. And I show you here the largest and one of the earlier examples of it, which is the Zollverein in Essen. At one point, the largest combination coal mine and steel factory in the world, largely abandoned, finally completely abandoned, had grown over with plant material and then turned into ruins. And it was slowly renovated and fixed up as were the structures around it, turned into places where people can come and go swimming, can go dining. There are museums built into it. Artists are working in ateliers. And there is a sense that these new structures have become the places that we go to not to work, but to admire, as we might go to Hadrian's Villa, or as we might go to the unfinished Sagrada Familia, in order to see the very ruinous and therefore romantic quality of the buildings, but also the memory of this age of production, but also the sheer openness, the scale, the grandeur that these kind of buildings were able to create. And I could again fill a whole lecture now with factories all around the world that have been reused in this manner. I don't know of any in Barcelona yet, but there certainly are some in Madrid I know of, and I'm sure there'll be some here as well. I show you just this example because when the Beijing Olympics happened, the Winter Olympics, the last Beijing Olympics, my social feed kind of lit up and people were saying, what is this horrible architecture? What are the Chinese trying to tell us? That we live in a Blade Runner world and that they're the biggest industrial power in the world. Why are we seeing the Olympics at this dystopian site? Well, in fact, what the Chinese had decided to do was to reuse what Mao had decreed should be the largest steel mill in the world, and had succeeded at that, and use the Olympics to turn it into a completely new district, which it did. And they used the grandeur of the structures to answer to the ski jumps and the new kind of buildings that were there. In the United States, this is the Bethlehem Steelworks, which is where I went on this field trip as an architecture student to marvel at the incredible grandeur of molten steel being produced that now also is a public park. This is the latest example by Herzog de Meuron, who of course did one of the biggest and most popular art museums built in an old factory, the Tate Modern, the second or third most visited museum in the world. This is the Power House in Gowanus, New York, in New York City, outside of the center of New York, although it's not the center anymore. It's an old electric power station that had been taken over by graffiti artists and kids holding parties there, and probably some of your friends, if you're old enough, partied there. But when this billionaire bought it and turned it into an art center, the requirement was that all of the graffiti be kept. And so they built the architecture around the remnants of all of the various stages of life that had occurred there. And from this kind of factory aesthetic, this kind of imaginative reuse is now seeping down into the everyday life of things like shopping malls. I show you two examples here from Atlanta, which I just like showing because Atlanta was the center of sprawl and the center of Crystal Towers, and now they are reusing an old, what was the largest storage site for stores, and turned it into a shopping mall, as well as a Google headquarters and apartments and many other things as well. But for me, the artists are really the ones who are pushing this aesthetic beyond art museums and beyond shopping malls and the other ways in which they're being used. And I show you here the Heidelberg project by Thierry Gutten, who just started painting what was his uncle's house one day and didn't stop until he had taken over a whole series of houses, both by painting them and by collecting all kinds of bric-a-brac and leftovers, some as memorials to people who had died, some just because he thought they were beautiful, but all of it having the effect of making this completely bombed out part of Detroit come to life again. The artist who has really pushed this the furthest is Theaster Gates, who again was trained as an urban designer, then learned how to be a master potter in Japan, then got a degree in theology, and then started a art center in South Chicago, right? Logical career path. Sure, again, familiar to many of you here. And he went to this one neighborhood, Dorchester Street, and started disassembling and reassembling both buildings and record collections and book collections, and then took that technique to projects all around the world with spaces he then occupies with a group that are called the Delta Monks, who perform a strange mixture between Buddhist incantations and soul music and gospel and pop music around and using these kind of artifacts that he then sells in order to support his art. That kind of sensibility, in turn, has now become something that is literally domesticated. And you can see it in houses in England at a smaller scale, or this very large scale version built into a ruin that is couldn't obviously be torn down or inhabited in any other way. I came across a beautiful example of it by a guy called De Vilder in Belgium, which was an old agricultural shed which people bought, were told they couldn't tear down. So De Vilder just skewed the roof slightly to create an open terrace space, put in a few new structural elements, and create a completely rambling and open environment. Here's another example in Korea, taking sheds by the side of the road and turning them into a restaurant and house. This is a place I visited recently, quite spectacular. It's the Anti-Villa by a guy called Brandtluber, B+, which is on the shore of a lake outside of Berlin. It was a lingerie factory, part of a lingerie factory, that he stripped down to its bare bones. He was then told he had to insulate it, so he did one ecologically not so nice thing, which was to spray on concrete, but I guess we'll have to forgive him that. He took off the roof, so he had to make a giant scupper to get the water off. That was his other addition. And then he just cut holes, and some of them were cut carefully, and some of them were just bush hammered out of there. And then the interior, again, is this completely open and fluid space. Here's a project right here in Mallorca that actually is social housing for the people who work to support the tourist industry there and otherwise can't afford to live in there. This is the work of a guy called Dennis Mayer, who, like some of the other architects I showed, he's actually an architect, teaches architecture as well, started renovating his house and adding things onto it, and never really stopped to the point where it became almost unlivable, and then expanded his remit by buying an old church and turning it into a school where he teaches kids from the mainly Black neighborhood the skills that they need to become carpenters and house builders and other kind of things, and fills it with the examples of all of the things that he's found all around it. I'm right now writing a book on a great firm based in London called Assemble, which is a cooperative of people with ever-changing members who about 10 years ago were invited up to Liverpool to a very poor area with many boarded up houses called Granby 4th Street. And they made proposals there and carried out a large amount of them, in which they didn't tear down the building, which is what the authorities wanted, but rather piece by piece put in a new fireplace there, a new bathroom here. They developed their own tile factory to make tile that fit within these houses. They insulated the houses, and then when there was one that was too far gone, they turned it into a winter garden that became the community center for this whole area, and is now where They have everything from yoga classes to registration classes to all kinds of community events. And this, 3 years ago now, was the most important, beautiful building in the world. Forget about Apple. And I can say that because I was on the super jury of the World Architecture Festival. The World Architecture Festival is one of these confabs that gets together and they decide this is the best office building in the world. This is the best house of under 500 square meter. This is the best house over 500 meter. I was on the jury for that one year. It was awful. This is the best landscape, etc. And then this year, I was on the jury that takes the winners from all of those and decides what is the winner, the best building in any category of any sort of the year. And we unanimously chose this place called the Lookhal in Tilburg in the Netherlands, which is a former tram depot that has now been turned into a library and community center in which many of the furniture, most of the furniture is built out of recycled materials, including the books, and in which they have left all of the industrial heritage completely visible and on display. And the other thing I find great about this is that there is no central heating or air conditioning in this building. There's heaters and coolers, and they're on sensors. So if you occupy a space, the heat or the cooling will turn on, and then when you leave, it will turn off again. So it's completely open and only heated or cooled by zone. I had a friend who studied here, and I said, does it really work? He said, well, you learn to bring a sweater, and for the first 10 minutes or so, you're cold, and then the heating really kicks in, and then it's perfectly comfortable. So that is the most important building in the world, but there are examples of it in France, this kind of work. In England, this is again by Assemble Studio. In Melbourne, this is a former monastery that has been turned into an art center with these kind of cuts going through it. And everywhere in these projects, I look for the ways in which the architecture reveals, confronts, allows you to admire all the different ages and uses that have taken place within these buildings. And this is right here in Barcelona, using particle board where insulation was needed, which, by the way, particle board is a much better solution than most other wood solutions. This is a project, a set of projects by the same guy that I showed the shed by, De Wilder, when he was in partnership with two people called, his name was Tailleux. He was in partnership with De Vink and Wilder. Sorry about that. You'll have to edit that out of the feed. But this was a project where they took the remnants of an old farmhouse and turned it into a nature center. And then this was a psychiatric center that they adapted so that it would be open and the patients would not feel as if they were in a psychiatric center. This was a shop that they did in the middle of Kent, where they took a whole floor out and allow you to see from one to the other, leaving the chimney in the middle. We actually just stole this idea for our new house, but don't tell anyone. And this is De Wilder and Vink by themselves. They were asked to renovate an old expo center in Charleroi. And again, there was no use and no money. So they left the building almost exactly the way it is. And they parked the cars in part of the building. They used part of the building for pop concerts. And this is actually shots taken about 3 months before the opening. So it's not that it's still going to be gussied up and made fancy. This is actually what it more or less is going to look like. And this attitude has gone so far that even as I travel around the world, I find myself staying in hotels, in old office buildings where you drink among the old boilers and look up at your ceiling and see what is left of the old structure. Or this beautiful example, the Círculo Mexicano in Mexico City, an old house that had been owned by the photographer Manuel Bravo that has now also been turned into a hotel, using and keeping many of these ruins. The real far edge of this kind of occupation is something that is almost not architecture. And in fact, you might question whether it is therefore more interesting as architecture. This is the Torre David. Some of you might know this project. It was to be the largest office building, tallest office building in Venezuela. It was never finished. And then about 20 years ago, a group of people just invaded and turned it into where they lived. And they occupied it all the way up to the 25th floor with no electricity, no elevators, nothing, and just turned it into a whole community. The architects of Urban Think Tank went there to try and figure out what they should do, talked to the people, thought they would help them with code compliance and making things more correct as they should be. And instead they realized that the best thing they could do was to let everyone know about that. So they went with a photographer, Iwan Ban, and photographed the community, which since then has been disbanded by the government, and showed how you can really make use of existing structures in radical ways. That group assembled that I've mentioned twice already started, and maybe this will also give you some ideas, at a birthday party in Cambridge, and they all decided that they didn't want to go work for big firms. They wanted to do their own thing. So someone said, okay, whoever wants to work on this, get together at this pub next week, and whoever showed up became Assemble. And the next stage was to lie on the floor of the squat of one of their members. And someone came up with the idea that they should use this petrol station, this station that was unused at the time, and turned it into a cinema. So they got permission, and they taught themselves how to sew. They found fabric that had been used for theater curtains. They went to a cinema institute and were given films to show, and were given seats that they could temporarily use. They got a bar license so they could have a bar there. And for summer, they had the Cineroleum, cinema and petroleum place. And that was really what launched them on their career. So this kind of temporary architecture that reuses existing structures is really what interests me more and more. The firm in Belgium, again, called Rotor DC, well, the firm is called Rotor. It started something called Rotor DC that specializes in reusing pieces of old buildings that no one loves, office buildings from the 80s and 90s and 70s, figuring out how to detoxify them and then selling them in an IKEA-like catalog. You can look on Rotor DC and find it there. The prototype for this was something called the Harvest Mat, which was put together by a firm called Super U Studio, based in Rotterdam, that made a software where you could figure out all the things that could be reused in your neighborhood and map them and make them available, and then figure out how to make buildings out of them. And they went on to make their own structures in which they reused doors and windows and pieces of subway train entrances and tiles and everything that they can find. They even reused turbines from wind turbines. They created their own offices. They created this campground on an island. This is the building I told you about that is made 96% from recycled or reused material. And here they again are in their own office. But they don't just stop with traditional building materials. They figure out how they can make buildings out of sinks or out of washing machines, or how they can make a club using tire trucks and automobile seats that they found at the junkyard. Again, I have found this now all over the world. I was taken down a series of very sketchy alleys in Bangkok to find this cafe workshop design office started by a former pupil of Zaha Hadid's, who had moved to Bangkok and started this place. And then he took me to this renovated no-tell motel in which the architect had added a layer of balconies on both the inside and outside, showing movies on the inside courtyard, and on the outside inviting vendors to take over up to the second floor so that the life of the street and the life of the building become completely intertwined. Another Belgian example, this is 51N4E, was asked to look at an old army barracks outside of Brussels, and they did almost nothing. They just opened up the structures. Then they built temporary gazebos in the middle of the open area. They found a bunch of old sewage pipes and turned them into a grand allée in which you can see Caesar marching after he was victorious in Gaul. And my favorite is actually the structure made out of discarded scaffolding that was no longer good to use and covered with nothing else but plastic bags, which sounds horrible, but when you go there, has this incredible diaphanous quality that create this small concert venue. You don't even have to make a building. In fact, not making a building is almost better. This is a project I think Vicente took me to a number of years ago. Those of us who are of a certain age grew up worshiping at the altar of Barcelona because of all of its great public spaces. But Vicente said, now I will take you to the latest public space, which is not in the center of the city, but up on the hills, but it just happens to have this great view of the city. And the young architect and landscape architect who won this had a strategy that they would only take away enough of the illegally built houses and leftover bunkers from the Second World War so that you could get the view, and leave just enough so that you wouldn't kill yourself. You could hurt yourself, that's okay. You could fall down some steps, but you shouldn't be able to kill yourself, and create this incredible palimpsest of the history of Barcelona all the way from before the Second World War and the Civil War to the future. The most famous example of this non-building is, of course, the High Line in New York by Diller, Scofidio, Renfro, and James Conner Field Operations. This project, the reuse of an old elevated train track, you could say is actually the most successful project in architecture because it has unlocked $15 billion worth of real estate value because it's completely transformed that part of New York. Now, the bad thing about that is it's $15 billion worth of luxury condominiums and things like that. But the effect of this structure in opening up the city, of giving you a new perspective, of revealing the history, the industrial history of the place, as well as the natural history, is spectacular. So I find myself more and more looking at buildings that might just do things like be electrostatically charged so that they collect all the dirt of Bangkok. Or this work by an artist called Mario Dewins, who goes to buildings that are about to be demolished, gets permission to take the things that are being demolished, stack them in a particular way, and then photograph them so that all that remains of the work are these photographs. And that leads me to the final point. I will try to wrap it up quickly, which is I told someone today, why fake it if you can make it? Was that you? Yes. So the reverse of that is why make it if you can fake it, which is to say you can create your own artificial histories just as you can create artificial everything today. And Rem Koolhaas, one of the world's greatest assholes, but also one of the most greatest architects still working today, did a lot of that at the Prada Foundation, where he reinvented these various buildings by doing everything from just cladding one with gold leaf. I should compare this to the first slide I showed, to making the one new part building appear as if it was under construction, and then working with Wes Anderson to create this cafe interior in which you're never quite sure whether you're in the 1920s, 1950s, and 1970s, or in fact in 2019, which is when this cafe was finished. Even more radical is the artist Jim Nelson, who does installations like this one at the British Pavilion in the Venice Biennale, where he rebuilt a courtyard of a housing area in Istanbul temporarily, including all of the interiors. And then another project by a group of artists from Kentucky who built a meth lab in an unfinished apartment building in Miami for the Basel Art Fair. This was again in Venice. This was the Italian pavilion in which they built a version of the sweatshops that exist to the west of Florence as a way to evoke that part of Italy that you as a tourist absolutely never see, all the way from the places where the people work to the places where the overseers live and work. And then you can take that even further through the work of someone like Gregory Crutzen, who goes to a part of rural Massachusetts and stages these photographs, which take weeks to put together, cost about $500,000 to assemble, all so that he can get on a crane and take this one super high resolution image in which everything you see is staged, but staged using the remnants of all of existing buildings, now reinvented as having a completely different reality, a different kind of place and time of which you are unsure. Is this really this part of Massachusetts, or is it a fantastical place? Is it what this was and is no longer? Is it what it is and still is today because history persists? Is this our current reality, or is this what we might be looking forward to in the future? Everything in this kind of art and architecture becomes uncertain. Buildings can become places where you project lives, as the artist Doug Aitken does in his Dream projects. And you can even just with a little bit of paint and one change to the, or set of changes to a railing, give the impression that in fact we are witnessing a glitch in the matrix. And you can begin to understand the instability of the reality that we live in today. The innards can become outers. The past can become present. The present can become the future. Now, of course, we have software that is going to allow us to do it to a much greater degree. These are a series of images by an architect called Cesare Battelli, an Italian who teaches in Madrid and creates these fantastical cities of a mythological place and time. So I will just tell you that I like to think of myself as being in the position of one of these crazy Russian guys who climb to the top of the tallest buildings they can find and look down. Traditionally, if you talk about architecture and think about architecture, you're looking for the newest, the greatest, the tallest, the shiniest, and you're looking up and outward and forward and to the future. And I'm more interested in looking down and in and back in a way that opens up that past, that present, to what might be in the future. I try to do it with some students at Taliesin, the Frank Lloyd Wright School, where I taught, who made some of their own installations in this matter. I try to do it in my own work, collaborating on some design competitions, but I would urge all of you to think about the great architecture that might be possible if instead of making the slickest grid, the most curvy building, the most impossible form, you just use either the hardware that's all around you, the stuff that's all around the street, the carcasses of everything that remains, your memories and your hopes to make possible architectures that do not involve raping and pillaging our natural resources, but rather turn you into a hunter and gatherer who makes good use of what's left over in our society and turns that into the best possible architecture. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Aaron, for your. This is the short version of your upcoming book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll read with interest. Is there any question, comment from the audience? Yes. Yes.
So at the beginning of the lecture, you spoke about you made a lot of overarching statements, mainly about the fact that you don't agree that I took this one slightly personally because we study at Valladolid, and you said that you do not see timber as the future of, let's say, building sustainably or building consciously. But at the same time, while the things you said were encouraging, but none of the examples you showed us were, let's say, social housing or were solving any problems as such. They were private residences, they were corporate offices, they were, public buildings.
Touche.
I did actually show several pieces. Yeah, no, but I showed several social housing projects in there. And you're right, many too few, and that is the issue. And that what I believe is that there are more possibilities in an architecture that opens up to existing structures, even for commercial uses, than in making more slick shopping malls. Now, do I think that will solve anything? No, I think it will contribute. And I do think that also we are beginning to see better experiments in social housing that do some of this kind of work. But I showed a project from Spain, projects from Asia, projects, and I could show a few more from China, especially where interesting work is going on. But you're absolutely right, not nearly enough. And that is because architecture always has been, is, and always will be the province of the governing elite, the people with the money and power to build it. So I think instead of giving up as architects, one of the things we can try to do is see if there are ways within the parameters that have been given us that we can try to open up the building blocks of our daily lives. Is it enough? Absolutely not. But at least we should stop using natural resources. At least we should open up our existing buildings. And yes, we should be moving towards social housing. But that will take a lot more than architecture, because we still live in a society in which Barcelona is one of the few exceptions, and even here it's very limited, where people who most need houses are treated to the least amount of space, material, anything that they need. And in the United States, it's even much, much worse. It's not even really made. So it's something in which architects have to work within a social context to try and make that change.
Over there.
Oh, thank you for the presentation. I think a couple of really, really good examples of how to reuse materials. And one question that was constantly popping during the presentation is, in your opinion, what is the biggest obstacle to reusing construction materials? Is it the processing? Is it the logistics? What do you think it is?
Thank you.
Good question. It's all of them. Cost is number one. As I'm sure you know, it is usually more expensive to renovate a building than to build new. That is changing. That is changing rather rapidly. I don't know the figures in Europe and in America. They're coming much, much closer together. That is ironically due to the second big obstacle, which is regulations, which mean that, for instance, how do you reuse steel because no one will certify that the steel still has the same staying power. But on the other hand, the regulations, especially in Europe, are helping in the other way. So I don't know if you know, but there is an EU directive that by 2025, 70% of all buildings are supposed to be made out of completely out of recycled material. It's a directive. And so different countries have interpreted that in different ways, places in the Nordic part of Europe more progressively. But those regulations are coming and biting more and more. And then the third, you're right, is logistics and organization, because obviously when things are completely standardized, it's much easier to work with them than when you're going to scrap heap and seeing what's there. Now, again, a lot of what I was trying to show, these harvest maps and things like that, are trying to do that. And there's very entrepreneurial people who are figuring out how to standardize those kind of reservoirs of materials and the methods for reusing them. So I have pretty good hope there. I think the trends are in the right direction, but right now, you're right. Right now, it's a reach. You're not going to let me go.
So I'm going to give you some context. Like, I come from Mumbai, where we have a huge, we had a lot of cotton mills that are being repurposed to make these sort of gentrified neighborhood shopping malls, basic consumerist sort of setting. You spoke a bit about how architecture now is reflecting capitalism, and the way we're building is a reflection of society. Is a gentrified neighborhood within a repurposed existing building a better option than a newly built suburb out of timber? Like, are you saying that do not build with new materials to the extent that all that we build now is within existing buildings, but it's catering to like 1% of the population?
No, I think we should not build new either for rich people or for poor people. I haven't been in Mumbai in quite some time, but I was just in Dhaka, which is somewhat similar, a few months ago. And it's incredible because they are building, it's a boom town because the economy is booming there. And in the meantime, the whole old center of the city is almost completely abandoned. And they are building new social housing, not enough, but some, out in the far outskirts, where it takes people 2 hours to get from there to where they might work, where there's no social network. And I was just flabbergasted. Why can't you rethink, reuse the existing inner city with all of its resources? And the answer was very simple, because the developers make their money by building out in the suburbs. So I think that you're right. The problem is, as soon in our capitalist system, as soon as you invest in something, people expect returns, meaning that richer people move there. So I think while we are fighting for reuse, we also need to be fighting as citizens to change our social system so that we are investing in those kind of places, not for a capital return, but for a human return.
One last question, comment? Yeah, okay.
We're making a documentary watch list. Do you have a documentary you recommend?
I have a documentary to recommend. No, I don't. I mean, there's a bunch of like Super U Studios and Assembled. A bunch of people have things on YouTube and on their websites and things like that. I don't know of anyone who's done a documentary. Maybe that's a job for you. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.